Greg lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where life was usually calm and predictable. The houses were all similar, with neat lawns and white picket fences. People here liked things orderly, and most of them got along well enough. Greg wasn't the kind of person who stood out too much. He was just an average guy in his mid-40s who enjoyed tinkering with gadgets and working on small projects around the house. Recently, he had finished building something that made him feel proud, an above-ground pool in his backyard. The pool wasn't huge, but it was big enough for him to float around on lazy afternoons. It brought him joy, especially during the hot summer months when the air seemed thick and sticky. Every evening after work, Greg would sit by the pool with a cold drink in hand, listening to the sound of water lapping against the sides. Sometimes he'd invite Lisa, his neighbor from across the street, over for a chat. She was friendly and always had interesting stories about her job as a teacher. They weren't close friends, but they got along fine, and their conversations helped pass the time. Everything changed one Tuesday evening when Karen showed up at Greg's door. Karen was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, which meant she spent most of her time telling people what they could or couldn't do with their properties. Everyone knew her name, though not always for good reasons. She was bossy and nosy, always quick to point out if someone's mailbox was painted the wrong color, or if their grass was half an inch taller than allowed. Some people tried to avoid her altogether, while others grumbled under their breath whenever she walked past. But no matter what anyone thought, Karen took her role very seriously. That night, she came storming toward Greg's house like a hurricane ready to sweep through town. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement as she marched down the driveway, her arms swinging stiffly at her sides. When she reached the front door, she didn't bother knocking gently. She pounded on it hard enough to make the windows rattle. Startled, Greg opened the door to see her standing there looking furious. "Greg," she snapped before he could even say hello. "I need to talk to you right now." He blinked, caught off guard. Sure, Karen. What's going on?" She stepped closer, invading his personal space without hesitation. "My daughter Tiffany is getting married next weekend," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "We're hosting the reception at my house, and I expect a lot of guests. Many of them will want to cool off outside, so naturally they'll want to use your pool." Greg frowned. "Wait, what? My pool?" "Yes, your pool," Karen repeated impatiently, waving her hands dramatically. "It's perfect for the occasion. You live right next door, and it makes sense for everyone to share resources. I've already told Tiffany's friends and family that they can use it. So, you'll need to clean it up and make sure it's ready by Saturday." Greg stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, I don't think that's a great idea. This is my private property. I didn't agree to let anyone use my pool, and honestly, I'd rather keep it to myself." Karen's eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Private property," she echoed, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, please, don't act like you're some kind of recluse. You're part of this community, Greg, whether you like it or not. And as the HOA president, I have every right to ensure that we maximize our neighborhood's assets for events like this." Greg felt his cheeks flush with frustration. "With all due respect, Karen, you can't just decide to use my stuff because you feel like it. That's not how this works." Karen crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at him. "Fine. If you refuse to cooperate, then maybe I'll have to remind you about some of the other rules around here, like how your fence isn't exactly up to code, or how those flower pots on your porch are technically obstructing the sidewalk." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a menacing whisper. "Do you really want to start a fight over something as silly as a pool?" For a moment, Greg considered arguing further. He wanted to tell her exactly what he thought of her threats and her high-handed attitude, but deep down he knew it wouldn't do any good. Karen thrived on conflict, and she wouldn't hesitate to drag this issue out until she got her way. Instead, he forced himself to take a deep breath and stay calm. "Look, Karen," he said slowly, trying to keep his tone steady. "I understand you're excited about your daughter's wedding, and I'm happy for her. But using my pool isn't going to happen. End of story." Karen huffed loudly, clearly annoyed that he wasn't backing down. "You're making a mistake, Greg," she warned. Mark my words, you'll regret this." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving Greg standing alone on his doorstep. Once she was gone, Greg closed the door and leaned back against it, letting out a long sigh. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Who did Karen think she was, marching over here and demanding access to his property? It was ridiculous, and more than a little infuriating. Still, as much as he hated to admit it, Karen had a way of making life difficult for people who crossed her. He'd seen it happen before, and he didn't want to become her next target. Later that night, Greg sat by the pool, staring at the water as it shimmered under the moonlight. He sipped a beer and tried to relax, but his mind kept drifting back to Karen's visit. He replayed their conversation over and over again, each time growing angrier at her audacity. How dare she assume she could dictate what he did with his own belongings? As the hours passed, an idea began to form in his head. An idea so absurd that it almost made him laugh out loud. At first he dismissed it as impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. Maybe there was a way to give Karen exactly what she wanted, while still keeping his dignity intact. By the time he went inside to bed, Greg had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Karen push him around, not this time. Tomorrow, he'd put his plan into action. And when she saw what he'd done, she might finally realize that messing with Greg wasn't such a smart move after all. The next morning, Greg woke up with a strange sense of excitement. His plan from the night before still felt ridiculous, but it also gave him a small thrill. For once, he wasn't just going to sit back and let Karen boss him around. He was going to do something unexpected, something that would make her stop and think twice about crossing him again. After finishing his breakfast, Greg grabbed his phone and started researching how to turn his pool into something unusable for swimmers. It didn't take long for him to stumble across an idea: Jello. Not just any Jello, though. He needed enough to fill the entire pool. Sure, it sounded wild, but that was part of the appeal. If he couldn't keep people out of his pool, he could at least make sure they wouldn't be swimming in it. With a grin, Greg opened a browser tab and began searching for bulk supplies of gelatin mix. To his surprise, there were companies online that sold industrial-sized packets specifically for large-scale projects like this. He clicked through a few websites, estimating how much he'd need based on the size of his pool. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of pounds of powder, but the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just about standing up to Karen anymore. It was about proving a point. By lunchtime, Greg had placed an order for enough gelatin mix to fill his pool completely. He also rented a massive water heater and several large mixing containers from a local equipment rental store. When the delivery driver arrived later that afternoon, Greg hauled everything into his backyard, setting up what looked like a makeshift laboratory. Neighbors passing by stopped to stare, some whispering to each other as they tried to figure out what he was doing. Lisa, his neighbor across the street, was one of them. She wandered over after spotting the unusual activity, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Hey, Greg," she called out as she approached. "What's all this stuff? Are you starting a science experiment or something?" Greg laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Not exactly. I'm filling my pool with Jello." Lisa blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "Jello? As in dessert Jello?" "Yep," Greg replied, nodding. "Karen thinks her wedding guests can use my pool next weekend, so I'm giving them exactly what they asked for, a pool they can step into but definitely won't swim in." At first, Lisa thought he was joking, but when Greg showed her the mountain of gelatin packets stacked neatly beside the pool, she realized he was serious. "Wow," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's bold. Do you really think this is going to work?" "It has to," Greg said with a shrug. "I mean, Karen made it clear she expects me to cooperate. Well, here's my version of cooperation. If she wants my pool, she can have it, but not the way she imagined." Lisa chuckled, clearly amused by the absurdity of it all. "You know, Greg, this might actually be the best way to handle Karen. She thrives on drama, so why not give her something truly dramatic to deal with? Pausing for a moment, she added, "Need a hand? This looks like a lot of work." Greg hesitated before nodding. "Sure, thanks, I could use the help." Together, they spent the rest of the day preparing the pool. First, they filled it halfway with water using a garden hose. Then, they set up the industrial heaters to warm the water, since dissolving that much gelatin required heat. Once the temperature was right, they began dumping packet after packet of gelatin mix into the mixing containers, stirring furiously until the powder dissolved completely. The process was messy and exhausting, but both Greg and Lisa found themselves laughing despite the hard work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard, they finally finished adding the last batch of gelatin. The pool now contained thousands of gallons of liquid that would soon solidify into bright red Jello. Standing beside it, Greg felt a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. What had started as a crazy idea was now a reality, and there was no turning back. "You know," Lisa said, breaking the silence, "this is either going to go down as the greatest prank in neighborhood history or the dumbest thing you've ever done." Greg smirked. "Probably both." They cleaned up their tools and packed away the empty gelatin boxes, leaving the pool to set overnight. Before heading home, Lisa turned to Greg and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I just want you to know I'm rooting for you. Karen needs someone to stand up to her, and honestly, this might be the perfect way to do it." Greg smiled, feeling grateful for her support. "Thanks, Lisa. That means a lot." When he went inside for the night, Greg couldn't stop thinking about how Karen would react. Would she be furious, embarrassed, or maybe even impressed by the sheer audacity of it all? Whatever her response, Greg knew one thing for certain. Saturday was going to be unforgettable. Saturday morning arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Karen's house was transformed into a bustling wedding venue, with tents set up in the yard, tables decorated with flowers, and chairs arranged neatly for the ceremony. Guests milled about, chatting excitedly as they admired the decorations. Meanwhile, Greg stayed close to home, watching from his window as the event unfolded. Around mid-afternoon, Karen appeared at his door again, this time wearing a sleek navy blue dress that screamed authority. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she strode toward his house, her expression unreadable. Greg braced himself, knowing exactly why she was here. "You ready for this?" Lisa whispered from behind him. She had come over earlier to see how things would play out and was now perched on the edge of Greg's couch, sipping coffee nervously. "As ready as I'll ever be," Greg muttered, opening the door before Karen could knock. "All right, Greg," Karen said briskly, stepping past him without waiting for an invitation. "It's time. My guests are asking about the pool. Let's go." Greg followed her outside, his heart pounding slightly as they approached the backyard. A small group of wedding attendees had gathered near the fence, curious about the mysterious pool Karen had promised them. When they caught sight of the shimmering red surface, their reactions ranged from confusion to outright disbelief. "What is that?" one woman asked, pointing at the wobbly mass. "It's Jello," Greg announced, unable to hide his smirk. "Just like I said it would be." Karen froze, her jaw dropping as she stared at the pool. For a moment she seemed speechless, her face turning an alarming shade soundlessly. Finally, she managed to choke out, "What did you do?" "I filled it with Jello," Greg replied calmly. "You wanted my pool, Karen. Here it is. Your guests can use it however they like, just don't expect them to swim." The crowd erupted into laughter, snapping photos and videos as word spread quickly among the wedding party. Some brave souls attempted to step onto the jiggly surface, only to slip and tumble into the sticky mess. Others simply gawked, shaking, their heads in amazement. Through it all, Karen stood frozen, her carefully planned event spiraling into chaos right before her eyes. Greg watched silently, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't just stood up to Karen. He'd turned her own demands into a spectacle she'd never forget. The chaos at the wedding reception quickly escalated into something no one could have predicted. Karen stood frozen near the edge of Greg's backyard, her face red with anger and embarrassment as guests swarmed around the Jello-filled pool. Some people laughed hysterically, while others snapped photos and videos capturing every absurd moment. The bright red Jello wobbled underfoot whenever someone tried to step onto it, sending them slipping and sliding in hilarious and sticky ways. One man wearing a crisp white suit attempted to show off by jumping onto the surface. Instead of landing gracefully, he sank ankle-deep into the gelatinous mess and flailed wildly, trying to regain his balance. His wife rushed over to help, only to lose her footing as well, leaving both of them sprawled across the jiggly surface. Their loud groans of frustration turned into uncontrollable laughter, drawing cheers from the growing crowd of onlookers. Karen, however, wasn't amused. She clenched her fists tightly, her knuckles turning white as she watched the spectacle unfold. Her daughter Tiffany, dressed in a flowing white gown, stormed over, looking mortified. "Mom, what is this?" she demanded, gesturing toward the pool. "You told everyone they could use the neighbor's pool. This isn't what I expected. For my wedding day, I didn't know he'd do this," Karen hissed back, glaring daggers at Greg, who leaned casually against his fence, watching the scene with a satisfied grin. "He sabotaged us?" Tiffany threw up her hands in exasperation. "This is so embarrassing. Everyone is laughing at us." Karen spun around, pointing a finger at Greg. "Fix this," she shouted, marching toward him. "Right now, drain that ridiculous thing and fill it with water." Greg raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I already gave you exactly what you asked for. A pool your guests can use. You never said how they should use it." "This isn't what I meant, and you know it," Karen snapped, her voice rising shrilly. "You're being petty and childish." Greg shrugged, keeping his tone calm and even. "Petty? Childish? That's rich coming from someone who marched over here demanding access to my private property. I let you have your way, Karen, just not the way you wanted." Several wedding guests had gathered nearby, openly eavesdropping on the argument. A few snickered quietly, while others exchanged amused glances. One older woman leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Good for him. Karen's been asking for this kind of pushback for years." Karen noticed the whispers and felt her face grow hotter. She hated being the center of attention when it wasn't on her terms. Desperate to regain control of the situation, she turned to the crowd and announced loudly, "Everyone, please ignore this nonsense and enjoy the rest of the reception. There's plenty of food and drinks inside." But her words fell flat. No one seemed eager to leave the entertainment provided by the Jello pool. In fact, more people were joining in, daring each other to walk or crawl across the slippery surface. Someone even brought out a camera drone to capture aerial footage of the bizarre scene. By the time Karen retreated back to her house, muttering furiously under her breath, the Jello pool had become the undisputed highlight of the wedding. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and the cleanup began, Greg sat on his porch, sipping a beer. Lisa joined him, carrying 2 slices of leftover wedding cake. "Well," she said, handing him a plate, "that was quite the show." Greg chuckled, setting down his drink. "I'll admit, it went better than I expected. Did you see Karen's face?" Lisa nodded, grinning. "It was priceless. Honestly, I think half the neighborhood is talking about it right now. Word spreads fast around here." As if on cue, Greg's phone buzzed with notifications. He glanced at the screen and saw multiple messages from neighbors, friends, and even acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. Someone had posted a video of the Jello pool online, and it was already racking up views and comments. One comment read, "This guy just won the neighborhood Olympics." Another joked, "Move over. TikTok trends. Jello pools are the new craze." Lisa scrolled through the comments with him, laughing at some of the funniest ones. "Looks like you're famous now," she teased. "Maybe you should start charging admission." "Not a chance," Greg replied, shaking his head. "This was just about making a point. If Karen wants to treat everyone else's property like her own personal playground, she needs to learn there are consequences." Lisa grew quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'll try to retaliate?" Greg sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Probably. Karen doesn't take things like this lightly. But honestly, I don't care anymore. Let her report me to the HOA or whatever she plans to do. At least I stood up for myself. True to Lisa's prediction, Karen wasted no time retaliating. On Monday morning, Greg received a formal letter from the HOA board, signed by Karen herself. It accused him of violating neighborhood guidelines by altering his property in a way that disrupted community harmony. The letter demanded that he drain the Jello immediately and pay a fine of $500 for causing a disturbance during the wedding. Greg read the letter with a mix of irritation and amusement. He crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash without a second thought. Later that afternoon, he attended the weekly HOA meeting, knowing full well that Karen would bring up the issue again. Sure enough, as soon as the meeting began, Karen launched into a tirade about Greg's behavior. What Greg did was completely unacceptable, she declared, pacing in front of the room. He deliberately ruined a special occasion for my family and caused unnecessary drama in our community. We need to hold him accountable for his actions. Some members nodded in agreement, but others looked skeptical. Ryan, a young father who lived a few houses down, spoke up. Hold on a second, Karen. Didn't you tell Greg that his pool had to be used for your daughter's wedding? Isn't that kind of overstepping? Karen bristled. That's beside the point. He knew what I meant, and instead of cooperating, he chose to act immaturely. Ryan crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. Sounds like you're the one who started this whole mess. Maybe if you hadn't demanded access to his private property, none of this would have happened. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Even some of Karen's usual supporters seemed hesitant to side with her this time. Encouraged by Ryan's boldness, Lisa chimed in. Greg has every right to decide how his property is used. Filling. The pool with Jello might have been unusual, but it was creative and honestly kind of brilliant. Karen, you can't expect people to just hand over their stuff whenever you feel like it. Karen's face flushed with rage, but before she could respond, another neighbor added, Besides, the wedding guests loved it. Half of them are probably still talking about it. It made the event memorable, didn't it? The meeting ended inconclusively, with no clear decision about whether Greg would face any real consequences. As he walked home afterward, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. For years, Karen had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, enforcing rules arbitrarily and punishing anyone who dared challenge her. But today, for the first time, people had pushed back, and they'd done it publicly. Over the next few days, Greg noticed a shift in the neighborhood dynamics. Neighbors who had previously avoided conflict with Karen began approaching him, thanking him for standing up to her. Some admitted they'd been frustrated with her high-handedness for years, but hadn't known how to address it. Others joked about the Jello pool, calling it the best prank in history. Even Ryan, the young father who had spoken up at the meeting, stopped by Greg's house one evening. Hey, Greg, he said, leaning against the fence. I just wanted to say thanks. You inspired a lot of us to rethink how we deal with Karen. She's been running roughshod over everyone for too long. Greg smiled, feeling a rare sense of camaraderie. Glad I could help. Honestly, I didn't plan for any of this to happen. It just sort of snowballed. Ryan nodded. Well, it's a good start. Maybe we can work together to make some changes around here. People are ready to stand up for themselves, and you showed them it's possible. As Greg watched Ryan walk away, he realized that his little stunt had accomplished more than he'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about getting back at Karen. It was about sparking a larger conversation about fairness and respect within the community. And for the first time in a long while, Greg felt hopeful about the future of his neighborhood. In the weeks following the wedding fiasco, life in the neighborhood began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Greg's Jello pool stunt had ignited something, a spark of rebellion against Karen's iron grip on the HOA. People who had once tiptoed around her rules now felt emboldened to speak their minds. Conversations that used to center around trivial complaints, like whose dog barked too loudly or whose lawn needed mowing, shifted to bigger topics: fairness, transparency, and respect for individual rights. At first, Karen tried to brush off the growing unrest as a temporary phase. She dismissed Greg's actions as a childish prank and assumed the neighborhood would soon forget about it. But she underestimated how much her behavior had grated on people over the years. Her constant nitpicking and threats had worn thin, and Greg's defiance gave others permission to push back. One Monday evening, during another HOA meeting, tensions boiled over again. Karen called the meeting to order with her usual air of authority, expecting everyone to fall in line as they always did. But this time, things were different. Ryan, the young father who had defended Greg at the last meeting, stood up almost immediately after Karen started speaking. "Before we get into the agenda," Ryan said firmly, "I think we need to talk about the way decisions are made in this neighborhood. A lot of us feel like our voices aren't being heard." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. "Ryan, we've been through this before. The HOA exists to maintain standards and keep property values high. If you have a problem with how things are run, maybe you should consider moving somewhere else." Her dismissive tone only fueled the frustration in the room. Lisa, sitting near the front, leaned forward and added, "That's not fair, Karen. You can't just shut people down when they disagree with you. We're all part of this community, and we deserve a say in how things work." Other neighbors nodded in agreement, murmuring their support. One man named Carl, who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand hesitantly. When Karen acknowledged him, he said, "I agree with Ryan and Lisa. It feels like the HOA is more about enforcing your personal preferences than helping the neighborhood. I think we need some changes." Karen's face turned red, but she quickly masked her anger with a tight smile. "Fine," she snapped. "If everyone has such strong opinions, let's hear them. But don't expect me to waste my time listening to nonsense." The meeting devolved into a heated debate, with residents airing grievances they'd kept bottled up for years. Some complained about Karen's habit of singling out certain houses for minor violations while ignoring others. Others brought up examples of her favoritism, citing instances where friends of hers received special treatment. By the end of the night, it was clear that Karen's leadership style had alienated many people, and they were no longer willing to tolerate it. Greg watched all of this unfold with a mix of surprise and satisfaction. He hadn't intended to start a revolution, but he couldn't deny that his Jello pool stunt had opened the floodgates. For years, Karen had dominated the neighborhood, using fear and intimidation to enforce her will. Now, thanks to his actions, people were finally standing up to her. Despite the newfound momentum, however, Greg knew there was still work to be done. While the recent meetings had exposed deep dissatisfaction with Karen's leadership, the HOA board itself remained unchanged. As long as Karen held power, nothing meaningful could happen. That realization led Greg to an idea, one that would take courage but might finally bring lasting change. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Greg sat down with Ryan and Lisa to discuss his plan. They met at Lisa's house, which had become an unofficial headquarters for the anti-Karen movement. Over cups of coffee, Greg laid out his proposal. He wanted to run for a seat on the HOA board. "I know it sounds crazy," Greg admitted, stirring sugar into his mug. "But if we want real change, we need someone on the inside pushing for it. Someone who actually listens to the neighbors instead of bossing them around." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're serious? You'd really put yourself out there?" Greg shrugged. "Why not? I already pissed Karen off enough to make her hate me forever. Might as well go all in." Ryan grinned. "I like it. Honestly, having you on the board could be exactly what this neighborhood needs. But running isn't easy. It takes time, energy, and convincing people to vote for you." "That's where we come in," Lisa said, leaning forward eagerly. "Put together a campaign, talk to the neighbors, and spread the word. If anyone can win, it's you." Over the next few weeks, Greg threw himself into the election process. With Lisa and Ryan's help, he created flyers promoting his platform. Transparency, collaboration, and respect for private property. They knocked on doors, attended neighborhood gatherings, and even organized a small barbecue to give residents a chance to meet Greg in person. Slowly but surely, support began to build. Not everyone was convinced, though. Some neighbors worried that electing Greg would create even more conflict with Karen. Others doubted whether he had the experience to handle the responsibilities of being on the board. But Greg didn't let the criticism discourage him. Instead, he focused on connecting with people and addressing their concerns directly. When election day finally arrived, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Voting took place in the community center, with residents lining up to cast their ballots. Greg spent the morning pacing nervously outside, wondering if his efforts would pay off. Lisa and Ryan stayed by his side, offering words of encouragement. By late afternoon, the results were tallied and announced. To everyone's shock, including Greg's, he had won a seat on the board. Cheers erupted from the crowd as Greg stepped forward to accept his new role. Even Ryan clapped him on the back, grinning widely. "Looks like you're officially part of the team now," he said. Karen, meanwhile, looked furious. She stormed out of the room without saying a word, leaving behind a trail of muttered curses. Later that night, rumors spread that she planned to resign from the HOA altogether. Whether true or not, one thing was certain: her reign of control was over. With Greg on the board, the neighborhood began to transform. New policies were introduced to ensure decisions were made democratically, rather than dictated by a single person. Rules became less rigid, allowing residents more freedom to personalize their homes. And perhaps most importantly, people started feeling like they belonged, not just to a neighborhood but to a real community. For Greg, the victory was bittersweet. He had never sought fame or attention, but his Jello pool stunt had changed everything. What started as a simple act of defiance had grown into something far greater, a reminder that standing up for yourself, even in the silliest ways, could inspire others to do the same. As he stood outside his house one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Greg felt a deep sense of pride. His backyard was quiet now, the pool drained and empty. But its legacy lived on, in the laughter of neighbors, the unity of the community, and the knowledge that sometimes a little bit of chaos could lead to something beautiful. With Greg now officially on the HOA board, the neighborhood entered a new chapter. For the first time in years, residents felt like they had a voice in how things were run. The old days of Karen's iron-fisted rule were fading fast, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. But while Greg's election marked a turning point, it didn't mean everything suddenly became smooth sailing. Change rarely happens overnight, and there were still challenges to face. Karen, predictably, wasn't taking her defeat lying down. Though she hadn't resigned from the HOA as some rumors suggested, she made it clear she wasn't happy about sharing power with Greg. At every meeting, she found ways to criticize his ideas or question his decisions. Her comments often came laced with sarcasm, as if she hoped to undermine him in front of the other board members. "You know, Greg," she said during one particularly tense meeting, "it's nice that you're so eager to make changes, but maybe you should focus on practical solutions instead of whatever it is you're doing." Greg didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he smiled politely and replied, "Thanks for the feedback, Karen. I'll keep that in mind." His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate her more, which secretly amused him. He knew better than to engage in petty arguments. After all, he'd already proven he could outwit her once before. Despite Karen's resistance, Greg's presence on the board brought fresh energy to the neighborhood. One of his first initiatives was to create a community feedback system. Residents could submit suggestions or concerns anonymously through an online form, ensuring everyone felt comfortable speaking up. This small change alone led to dozens of ideas pouring in, everything from improving street lighting to organizing monthly block parties. Lisa played a key role in helping Greg implement these changes. She volunteered to coordinate the block parties, using her experience as a teacher to plan fun activities for kids and adults alike. The first event took place on a warm Saturday afternoon, with food trucks parked along the cul-de-sac and music playing softly in the background. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before mingled freely, laughing and sharing stories. Even Ryan brought his family, including his 2 young children, who spent hours running around with their friends. Greg stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with a mix of pride and relief. It was moments like these that reminded him why he'd decided to get involved in the first place. Sure, dealing with Karen was frustrating, but seeing the community come together made it all worthwhile. As weeks turned into months, Greg noticed another unexpected benefit of his Jello pool stunt. It had become a symbol of unity for the neighborhood. People still joked about it whenever they saw him, often asking if he planned to fill the pool with Jello again anytime soon. Some even suggested turning it into an annual tradition, a tongue-in-cheek way to celebrate standing up to authority. One evening, Lisa approached Greg with a mischievous grin. "What do you think about hosting a Jello pool party next summer?" she asked. "We could invite everyone, charge a small fee for snacks, and donate the proceeds to charity." Greg laughed, shaking his head. "You're serious? People would actually show up for that?" "Are you kidding?" Lisa replied. "Of course they would. It's quirky, it's fun, and it gives people a chance to bond over something ridiculous. Plus, it's for a good cause." The idea stuck with Greg, and he mentioned it at the next HOA meeting. To his surprise, the board loved it. Even Karen, who usually opposed anything Greg proposed, grudgingly admitted it might be a clever way to raise money for local charities. With unanimous approval, plans for the Jello pool party began taking shape. While the neighborhood thrived under its newfound sense of community, Karen struggled to adapt. Without her usual control over the HOA, she seemed lost, unsure of how to fit into the changing dynamic. Her attempts to regain influence grew increasingly desperate. She started nitpicking minor details at meetings, insisting on strict adherence to outdated rules no one cared about anymore. When that failed, she tried rallying support from her closest allies, but even they seemed reluctant to back her. Eventually, Karen stopped showing up altogether. Rumors spread that she was considering moving out of the neighborhood, though no one knew for sure. Whatever the case, her absence left a noticeable void, not because anyone missed her bossiness, but because it highlighted just how much progress had been made without her interference. Without Karen looming over them, the HOA meetings became shorter, more productive, and far less stressful. Board members worked together seamlessly, focusing on projects that benefited everyone rather than enforcing arbitrary standards. Under Greg's leadership, the neighborhood transformed into a place where people genuinely looked out for one another. One crisp autumn morning, Greg received a letter in the mail. It was addressed in neat flowing handwriting, and when he opened it, he found a note from Karen. The message was brief and surprisingly civil. "Dear Greg, I've decided to sell my house and move closer to my daughter Tiffany. While I may not agree with everything you've done, I will say this: you've inspired some positive changes in the neighborhood. Take care of it. Sincerely, Karen." Greg read the note twice, unsure what to make of it. Was this Karen's version of an olive branch? Or was she simply trying to save face before leaving? Either way, he couldn't deny that her departure marked the end of an era defined by tension and fear. When news of Karen's decision reached the rest of the neighborhood, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated openly, relieved to see her go. Others expressed mild sympathy, acknowledging that despite her flaws, she had cared deeply about maintaining order. But regardless of how they felt, everyone agreed on one thing: the neighborhood was better off without her constant meddling. Winter approached. Greg found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since the infamous Jello pool incident. What had started as a personal act of defiance had snowballed into something far greater: a movement toward kindness, collaboration, and understanding. He never imagined filling his pool with gelatin would lead to such profound changes, both within himself and among his neighbors. One chilly December evening, Greg hosted a small gathering at his house to celebrate the holidays. Lisa, Ryan, and several other neighbors joined him, bringing plates of cookies and bottles of wine to share. They sat around the living room, swapping stories and reminiscing about the past year. "You know," Lisa said, raising her glass, "if it weren't for your crazy idea, we probably wouldn't be here like this. So here's to Greg, and to Jello pools everywhere." Everyone laughed and clinked their glasses together, the sound echoing warmly in the cozy space. As Greg looked around at the smiling faces, he realized something important. Sometimes the smallest acts of rebellion can spark the biggest transformations. And in a world that often feels divided, finding joy in the absurd can bring people closer than anyone ever expects. The night ended with laughter, hugs, and promises to make the upcoming Jello pool party the best event the neighborhood had ever seen. For Greg, it was proof that standing up for yourself, no matter how silly or unconventional, could create ripples of change that lasted a lifetime. The following summer arrived with a wave of anticipation. The neighborhood had been buzzing for weeks about the upcoming Jello pool party, and Greg felt both excited and nervous. It was one thing to joke about turning his pool into a giant dessert, but quite another to actually host an event based on it. Still, he couldn't deny how much the idea had captured everyone's imagination. From kids dreaming of splashing around in colorful gelatin to adults reminiscing about Greg's original prank, the party had become the talk of the town. Lisa took charge of organizing the details, her enthusiasm infectious. She coordinated food trucks, arranged for live music, and even set up a small booth where people could vote for their favorite Jello flavor. "Red is classic," she told Greg during one planning session, "but we should mix it up this time. How about blue raspberry or lime green?" Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Whatever you think works best. You're the expert at this stuff." With Lisa handling logistics, Greg focused on preparing the pool itself. He rented the same industrial equipment he'd used before, though this time he enlisted help from several neighbors eager to pitch in. Together, they worked late into the night, dissolving hundreds of pounds of gelatin mix and carefully pouring it into the pool. By sunrise, the backyard was filled with the sweet aroma of fruit-flavored Jello, its surface shimmering under the early morning light. On the day of the party, the neighborhood came alive with energy. Families gathered in Greg's yard, spilling onto the street as food trucks lined the curb and speakers blared cheerful tunes. Kids ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter mingling with the chatter of adults catching up over plates of barbecue and lemonade. The centerpiece of it all, the Jello pool, drew constant attention, its vibrant colors gleaming invitingly under the sun. Greg stood near the edge of the pool, watching as people cautiously approached it. Some dipped their toes in, giggling at the squishy sensation. Others jumped straight in, landing with a satisfying plop that sent ripples through the wobbly surface. A group of teenagers filmed themselves attempting daring stunts, while younger, children delighted in simply rolling around in the sticky mess. Lisa wandered over, holding 2 cups of punch. "Well," she said, handing him one, "this is officially the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, and also the most fun." Greg grinned, sipping his drink. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad Karen pushed me to do it the first time. Look at everyone. They're happier than I've ever seen them." Lisa nodded, glancing around at the scene. "It's amazing what happens when people come together like this. Who knew a silly prank could turn into something so meaningful, see?" The afternoon wore on. The party only grew more lively. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other now laughed and shared stories as if they'd known each other for years. Even Carl, the quiet man who rarely attended HOA meetings, joined in the festivities, proudly showing off photos of his dog wearing a tiny life jacket made out of foam. By evening, the sky turned shades of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Greg climbed onto a small stage set up near the pool, microphone in hand. The music faded as he tapped it lightly, drawing everyone's attention. "Hey everyone," he called out, smiling as cheers erupted from the audience. "First, I just want to say thank you for coming today, for supporting this crazy idea, and for being part of such an incredible community. None of this would have happened without all of you." He paused, letting the applause die down before continuing. "When I filled my pool with Jello last year, I didn't think it would lead to anything like this. Honestly, I just wanted to stand up for myself. But what started as a little act of defiance turned into something bigger. A reminder that we don't have to settle for things the way they are if we can make them better." Greg's voice softened as he looked out at the sea of faces. "So, here's to standing up for ourselves, not just against bullies like Karen, but for the kind of world we want to live in. A world where we take care of each other, respect each other, and maybe, just maybe, have a little fun along the way." The crowd erupted into applause again, louder this time. Someone shouted, Speech, which prompted laughter and scattered, clapping. Greg stepped down from the stage, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude wash over him. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the cleanup began, Greg found himself sitting by the empty pool with Lisa. They sat quietly for a moment, listening to the distant hum of crickets and the occasional car driving by. "You know," Lisa said finally, breaking the silence, "you've become kind of a legend around here." Greg laughed softly, shaking his head. "All I wanted was a little peace and quiet. And instead you got chaos," Lisa teased, nudging him playfully. "But seriously, Greg, you've done something special. This neighborhood wouldn't be the same without you." Greg glanced at her, then back at the pool. "It wasn't just me, everyone pitched in. Without people like you and Ryan, none of this would have worked." Lisa smiled, leaning back on her hands. "Still, you were the one who started it. That takes guts." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of leftover Jello and grilled food. Greg let his mind drift, thinking about everything that had changed since that fateful day when Karen stormed onto his porch demanding access to his pool. Back then, he'd been frustrated, annoyed, and unsure of how to handle the situation. Now he felt grounded, like he belonged somewhere for the first time in years. "Do you think Karen's happy wherever she is?" Lisa asked suddenly, her tone thoughtful. Greg shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe she needed a fresh start too. Either way, I hope she's okay." Lisa nodded slowly. "That's a good way to look at it. Sometimes people just need space to figure things out." They stayed like that for a while longer, enjoying the quiet camaraderie. Eventually, Lisa stood up, brushing off her jeans. "All right, I should probably head home. Big day tomorrow." Greg followed suit, stretching his arms above his head. "Yeah, thanks for everything, Lisa. I couldn't have done any of this without you." She smiled warmly. "Anytime, Greg. Good night." "Good night." As Greg locked up the house and turned off the lights, he took one last look at the backyard. The pool was empty now, its surface smooth and unremarkable. But in his mind it remained full, not with Jello, but with memories of laughter, connection, and triumph. Walking upstairs to bed, Greg realized something important. The Jello pool had been more than just a prank or a symbol of rebellion. It had been a catalyst, a spark that ignited a chain reaction of kindness, unity, and courage. And as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance could create the biggest waves of change.